New Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent getting down to business as Trump freezes federal grants and loans in an effort to get rid of government waste. Joining us now to discuss this and more is former White House economic advisor Steve Moore. Steve, good morning to you. Great to see you.
Hi, Jan. Good morning.
First, there was this hysteria from, this pause in federal aid because they were trying to say it did not include individual assistance. It does not include that going directly to Americans. So we're talking Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Pell Grants, all that kind of stuff. So explain the purpose behind this memo, which was really to get rid of government funds going toward any DEI programs, the Green New Deal, any things that were not under the America First agenda.
Yeah, so this is basically Donald Trump asserting the power to not spend money that's been authorized and appropriated by Congress. And I do believe, Jan, that this will go to the courts or maybe even to the Supreme Court to decide, what discretion does the president have in terms of controlling spending. It is true that this money was appropriated by Congress. What the president is saying is, look, we're running a $2 trillion deficit. We don't need all this money, so let's save it. By the way, every president from George Washington through Richard Nixon had something called the impoundment power, which gave the president the authority to not spend money. That was stripped away from the president in 1974. So I think this is going to be resolved in the weeks ahead. Of course, as a fiscal conservative, I'd like to see the president, any president, have the authority not to spend money if it's not needed.
Exactly. Speaking of which, Trump is looking to do that to also cut taxes. Meantime, liberal governors have been implementing new tax policies around the country. Let's just take a look at Maryland, for example. Governor Westmore, do you live in Maryland?
I do.
He announced. How did I know that? He announced he's going to raise taxes on the top 20% of earners in his state. He also wants to charge a 1% surcharge on capital gains. For certain households. Are we going to start seeing businesses and people moving out of Maryland?
Yeah, you will. And in fact, that's one of the big stories about what's happening in America is, if you look at the states with the highest taxes, you know what those are. California, New York, New Jersey. Those states are losing a lot of their population to states like Florida, states like Texas, states like Tennessee that have no income tax. So people really are moving, and not just people, but business owners are moving their businesses out of those states. And so I think it's a big problem for Maryland. Maryland is already a pretty high tax state. To raise them further is just going to, by the way, I do live in Maryland, but I live about 2 miles away from Virginia. So if taxes get too high, I could just go across the river and move into another state.
Which is what a lot of people have done already, right? I also want to talk to you about this new analysis by payroll firm ADP, which found that the country's highest median annual pay as of December is from employees in Washington, D.C., where salaries right now are 33% more than the next richest state. What does that tell you, Steve?
Well, it tells you there's a swamp in Washington, and that's why around the country the drain the swamp message is so resilient, because people wonder, well, why are people, getting taxpayer money and getting more money than I make on my job as a truck driver or a, kitchen helper or, an accountant. So there's a kind of premium that is paid to federal workers. And that's not fair to the people who paid their taxes and have to support those salaries. So I think that's going to cause a little bit of a backlash among voters around the country who are saying, why? By the way, there are some states where the average pay is only half of what people make in Washington, D.C.
Correct. This was just the next richest state. So 33% more than the next richest state. And as you mentioned, we're talking federal workers and federal lawmakers who are deciding what those salaries are.
Exactly. And there's going to be a big debate in the months ahead, because Trump just put out another executive order saying we're going to cap federal salaries. We're going to cap federal hiring. Again, this is something, unfortunately, it's necessary because we're running a $2 trillion deficit. We can't keep hiring more workers. How many times have we talked about this in the last year and a half on your show, that the biggest area of growth of hiring has been in government? Well, we can't afford that anymore. We're running huge amounts of debt. So we'll see whether Trump can trim that federal bureaucracy. He also wants to, did you see this one, Jan? He wants to require these federal workers to show up for work on the job. You're not just going to phone it in and get a big pay salary when you're not actually on the job at the federal buildings.
Right, and if you resign today or within the next, week or so, then you can still collect your salary until, September? It's a pretty generous
This
offer.
is like a buyout.
Yeah.
He's talking about saying, well, let's reduce, and that's a fair way to do it, saying, we'll give you an incentive because we have too many federal employees to, you'll get a buyout, which is what a lot of private sector employers do. We'll see how many federal workers take advantage of that.
Former White House economic advisor Steve Moore, always great to see you, sir. Hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, Jan.